Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for May 6th, 2022. We're in a situation where the unipolar extremists are acting in a completely unhinged manner, continuing to insist that the war in Ukraine be continued until there's a defeat of Russia, a military defeat of Russia, while they're escalating the economic warfare to degrade the Russian economy. And now we hear they're planning economic warfare against China. Well, it's working so well against Russia. Why not try it against China? And of course, I'm being sarcastic. The economic warfare is not stopping Russia from continuing to pursue their security guarantees, but it is having a boomerang effect against Western economies. Well, that doesn't seem to matter to the NATO think tankers at the Atlantic Council, which is one of the leading think tanks that's involved in planning the various war games and geopolitical assaults to protect the unipolar order. They had issued a report on April 27th on what would happen with a full economic warfare action against China. The pretext for this would be China's refusal to join the attacks against Russia. And so they're running war games, and here are some of the proposals they're making. Seize foreign reserve assets of China. This is in the trillions of dollars. They seized 300-some billion from Russia, but now they're talking about over $1 trillion. Cut China off from the SWIFT financial transaction system. Cut off exports and imports from China, and sanction other countries that export and import goods from China. The Atlantic Council senior fellow who reported this is named Hung Tran. He's a former banker, former International Monetary Fund official, and he said that in a scenario of Western sanctions against China and Chinese countermeasures, quote, both sides will suffer substantial consequences. This could lead to a situation of economic MAD, that is mutually assured destruction, unquote. So he's admitting that when they run these war games, it has an enormous blowback effect against other countries. Do you think that will stop them? Do you think they really care about the effects on you of the economic warfare policies that are being run through sanctions and the actual continuing to fund the war in Ukraine? Of course they don't care. And they're not just wargaming, they're preparing for it. On May 3rd, there was a phone call between Secretary of State Blinken and Foreign Secretary Liz Truss of the United Kingdom. The State Department report on it said that the major topic was, quote, economic consequences for those who continue to provide financial or material support to Russia, unquote. In other words, China. At the end of this month, Biden is going to be shunted off to Asia for some meetings. This is to formalize or to expand the existence of a global NATO into the Asia-Pacific region to encircle China. Now, we've been insisting that Western military officials and others must come out and counter the wartime propaganda, which basically continues to blame Russia and continues to insist that Russia's losing the war in Ukraine. Well, the latest to speak out was Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, the former top advisor to Colin Powell, who broke with Powell eventually over the Iraq weapons of mass destruction and so on. Wilkerson said that it's crazy to push a nuclear superpower to the point where they see no other option except possibly using nuclear weapons. He joins Colonel Danny Davis, Douglas McGregor, and other military officials who have been condemning this war, pointing out the extreme disaster that awaits us if the Russians conclude they have no option but to accelerate a war and fight the United States. Now, we're pushing them into that, and that's what Wilkerson is warning against. Now, one other sign of the insanity is a New York Times article headlined, U.S. intelligence is helping Ukraine kill Russian generals, unquote. Now, of course, since it's from U.S. intelligence, you don't know for sure whether it's true or psychological warfare. The Times itself, in its coverage, says that people in the U.S. military intelligence establishment believe that warning Russia that the United States and NATO are fully backing Ukraine might have an effect on them. But this is the same, it sounds like the same intelligence people who concluded that the Russians were paying bounties to the Taliban to kill Americans in Afghanistan. It turned out that that was a completely false, bogus report, as so many of these are. So that brings me to some of the questions for today. And actually, the first one in a sense, goes back to this question of the intelligence warfare, psychological warfare, and lying. Someone wrote and asked, can the Congress block the establishment of the Disinformation Governance Board, which was announced this last week by Biden, with a nutcase, Nina Jankowicz, set to head it up? Well, I don't know if Congress has a role in stopping it. I guess they can cut the funding. But Senator Rand Paul had a very sharp critique of this when the Department of Homeland Security, whose department will oversee this governance board, was testifying. And Rand Paul asked him, do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in history is? And he said, the United States government. And he gave some examples, such as the role of McNamara building the Vietnam War, Reagan lying about Iran-Contra, George W. Bush on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And then he brought up the Steele dossier. And he said, do you think Americans are too stupid to figure out that this is disinformation? And he said, you continue to refuse to admit the truth about Russiagate, which is true. There are many, many people, such as Adam Schiff, who's a leading proponent of expanding NATO operations in Ukraine. Schiff continues to insist that Russia was behind Trump's election in 2016. So at least Rand Paul is in there throwing some punches on this. But as to whether or not, I don't think it's a cabinet post. I don't think you can prevent Jankowicz from taking the position. The question is, could funds be cut off from it? Now, there's a second question. Is there a chance China can be broken from supporting Russia? And the person who wrote it said, I don't think so. China has been very clear on this. And the more we attack Russia economically, the more China would be impelled to support Russia. Well, I think that's true. I think that's the main point. The February 4th agreements between Putin and Xi Jinping were very solid across the board. And the fact that the U.S. has been escalating against Russia sends a clear signal to China, which we now see also with this Atlantic Council report I mentioned, that China would be next. So from the Chinese strategic standpoint, and the Chinese are not stupid, they know that if Russia is defeated, China will be next. So it's not a question of the military alliance being predominant, but can the Russians and the Chinese play a financial card as a flank to undermine this unipolar Anglo-American war effort? And I think that's much more likely than the idea that you could pull off a Nixon policy of pitting Russia against China and China against Russia. But they're going to try it. Now, the next question was someone who wrote, will Germany reverse its anti-nuclear energy policy given the problems coming up and the likelihood of an embargo of Russian oil and gas? Let me tell you this from my firsthand view of what's happening here in Germany. The German government has gone into a completely insane flight forward. As late as April 22nd, Chancellor Scholz was saying there's no way Germany would support sending weapons to Ukraine, heavy weapons to Ukraine. He also said there's no way they would cut off oil and gas because the cost would be too much for the German economy. Well, they've since gone over the cliff and agreed to send tanks to Ukraine. And now there's very serious talk about a full embargo on Russian oil and gas. And what are they going to replace it with? Well, here's the irony. The Green government, which includes Baerbock as foreign minister and Habeck as economics minister, they're saying we're going to produce more electricity from coal. But I thought coal was the most polluting source of electrical production. Well, this has nothing to do with so-called global warming. It has everything to do with Germany being a sub-colony of the Anglo-Americans. And what makes it work is not just the corruption of the political officials in the Bundestag and in the political parties. Only the so-called extreme left and extreme right, the Linke Party and the AfD, voted against the weapons distribution to Ukraine, which shows that those two parties, which are called extremist parties, are much more in tune with rationality than the so-called major parties, none of which got more than a quarter of the vote in the last election. But the big problem in Germany is that the population bought into the green policy. You look at the school system, you look at the Fridays for Future movement, Greta Thunberg, you look at the output of material from the Potsdam Institute and other places promoting the idea that carbon dioxide is the greatest threat to human existence. And it's been swallowed hook, line, and sinker by much of the German population. Now, the question is, when the prices go to the point that they're no longer affordable to heat your home in the winter, to cook your food, to purchase food, to drive your car, will the Germans then start to question the adherence to the green policy? And if you drive on the German Autobahn, you see windmills everywhere. And most of the time, they're sitting there not turning. So I can't imagine that the average person in Germany driving down the Autobahn doesn't see that the windmills aren't turning, that the gas prices are going through the roof, and gas prices here are much higher than in the United States. So will there be a shift? Well, the European Union just said that nuclear energy is not part of a carbon problem. So we'll see. We'll see how brainwashed the German population is. But when it comes to strategic matters, Germany has no voice. It's totally subordinated to NATO and the US, and it's given up its sovereignty. Now, the final question, and I got this from at least 5 people. What can someone do to protect their family in the case of a financial crash? What happens to pensions and so on? And of course, this was in response to my update 2 days ago, where I said that the interest rate hike is likely to lead to a financial tsunami, including the possibility of a chain reaction default of corporate bonds, of private and government debt. And so clearly people are unnerved by this for legitimate reasons. We are heading toward a calamity, a catastrophic breakdown of the whole system. Now, how do you protect yourself? I know many people who listen to my updates think that they can somehow be prepared for this by storing food and grain, water, other kinds of measures. And you can go on the internet and find all sorts of these. But here's the problem. A nuclear war, you can't protect yourself by prepping from a nuclear war unless you have 2 years food supply and dig down deep into the earth, which is, by the way, what some of the financial establishment have done. You can't protect your personal finances from hyperinflation unless you're super wealthy. We learned this lesson from the Weimar hyperinflation, and you can see it now. If you have savings, if you have pensions, the fact that the value of this is being reduced by the inflation is evident to you when you go into a grocery store and see what you're paying for food. But more importantly, what happens when the supply chain breaks down completely? When there's not food at the grocery store? When the money system doesn't work? When the ATM doesn't produce any cash for you? What happens under those circumstances? What happens to pensions? At a certain point, the government will not be able to back up the pensions. And the private pension plans are woefully inadequate. The government plans, including the Social Security, are inadequate. So what's the ultimate protection? Buying gold and real estate? No. The ultimate protection is to join us and fight for a new global economic and financial architecture. We're very close to the point where we can do that. In fact, it's probably easier if many of you got off your rear ends and got out and started organizing. And I know some of you are. I'm not being critical. But a lot of you who are worried about this and can't sleep at night, join with us. Stay in touch with the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization. Participate in our activities. We have plans as to how we can bring the United States away from the transatlantic global oligarchy, away from the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund, to function as a sovereign nation state, working with other sovereign nations, including Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and eventually maybe even European countries, to set up a new financial system not based on control of financial assets and credit in the hands of the private bankers working through the central banks like the Federal Reserve, but where nations set up national banks that assure a credit policy that the credit will go to physical goods production and that there'll be a surplus which can be spent to develop new technologies, research and development, education, and so on. That's the solution, the LaRouche 4-point plan. It will work. That's how the United States got out of debt at the end of the Revolutionary War. That was the direction we were going in after World War II, until the Nixon administration was convinced to take the dollar off the gold reserve standard and move into a casino economy based on the idea of free market Austrian school economics. All it's done is create speculative bubbles and a collapse of the physical economy. If you want to have assured survival, join with us and fight for the LaRouche plan. And I'll put a link at the bottom of the description page to the 4-point LaRouche plan for how we get out of this economic crisis. Politically, it's possible if people get out and organize. So thanks for joining me this week, and I'll see you again next week.